So now, my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Ann Pearce. Ann coordinates the Wisconsin First Detector Network out of UW-Madison. The Wisconsin First Detector Network is a statewide citizen science program that encourages people to take action on invasive species through education and volunteer opportunities. Prior to her work with Wisconsin First Detector Network, Ann worked for several years at environmental education centers and on ecological restoration and hiking trail conservation projects around the country. Thank you so much for joining us, Ann.
Glad to be here, Claire, and hello, everybody. If you're having weather anything like we are in Madison, it's a little hard to start thinking about plants when the snow is covering the ground again, but today we will indeed talk about plants. I like to start the discussion about invasive plants by thinking about what is a weed. And you can ask this question to anybody and get a lot of different answers. And really, a weed is just a plant out of place. So obviously, what is a weed to one person might be a beautiful native milkweed supporting pollinators to another person. But to inform our discussion about invasive plants, I like to cover a few other topics as well. So weeds can be native or non-native. A great example of a native weed is giant ragweed. Of course, this is a commonly known agricultural and garden pest and an allergen for many of us. And so because of those properties, a lot of us consider this to be a weed. I also want to point out that not all non-native plants are necessarily weedy or invasive. And so the tulip is an example of what we call a casual non-native plant. So casual meaning that this plant depends on humans to persist in the environment. So if you think about tulips, they don't really spread on their own. They depend on us planting their bulbs for them to be able to grow. Another example of a non-native plant in a different category is Timothy grass. So this one we consider to be a naturalized non-native plant, which basically means that it can persist without human intervention. And so Timothy doesn't need us to help it spread. It spreads on its own. But it really hasn't been documented as spreading very widely or aggressively. So that brings us to invasive plants, and where do they fit amongst this classification? So we'll use Dame's rocket as an example. So just like the Timothy that I just mentioned, invasive plants are naturalized non-native plants. So they persist on their own without human intervention, but additionally, they grow or spread rapidly in their new range, and they cause or they have the potential to cause harm. And that can be economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human or animal health. Briefly, I want to touch on a few of the common impacts of invasive plants, and this is going to be a very quick overview. If you've done anything with invasive plants before, you might already be aware of these or other impacts that I won't cover. So one example is that invasive plants often directly compete with vegetation. In this example, we have wild chervil, which we commonly see along roadsides, but it can also spread into grassland and pasture settings. And it really just becomes the only thing growing in that area. And that's pretty common of a lot of our invasive plants. Invasive plants also typically provide very poor habitat. So here's an example of a wetland that's been invaded by purple loosestrife. And if you are familiar with purple loosestrife, you know it has really beautiful flowers, and you may have even seen pollinators foraging on these flowers. And then you might think to yourself, well, it can't be all that bad if pollinators are using it. And this is true of a lot of our weedy and invasive species. But take a second look and consider this wetland. What are the pollinators going to forage on when the purple loosestrife isn't blooming? And the answer is there might not be anything left for them to forage on at other times of the year. And so one of the biggest impacts we see from invasive plants to our wildlife populations is that when they take over an area, they're often the only available resource, and they're only available for a limited time during the growing season or throughout the year. And finally, Here's an example of a plant that causes harm to human health. This is wild parsnip. If you live anywhere in southern Wisconsin or southern Minnesota, you probably see this like wildfire along our roadsides. But with wild parsnip, if you have any sap from any part of the plant that comes in contact with your skin and then your skin is exposed to UV light, it actually causes a chemical reaction that gives your skin a burn. And so this is an example of an invasive plant that I'm really concerned about from a public health perspective. Now, if you're thinking about your school forest or school gardens and you're trying to figure out whether something is invasive or weedy and whether you need to deal with it, we want to talk about a few tips that you can think about when you're trying to identify these plants. And I want you to think about this question. Isn't a weed just a weed? Does it really matter if we identify something down to species? And we're going to use some photos of a particular plant to guide us through this little exercise. So the photo that's shown here on the right side of your screen is a plant that I took this picture of it in late April or early May last year, so relatively early in the season. So not always easy to identify this plants at this time of year. And so when you're trying to identify a plant, at this stage, maybe all you can look at are the leaves. And so thinking of our field guide language, it appears as though our PowerPoint slide has altered my images, but on the left side of the screen, you have a simple leaf, meaning you have one leaf blade coming off of a leaf stem. You can have pinnately compound leaves, which if the image were to show up correctly, would show the 3 leaves on the left also coming from this main leaf stem. So these 6 little leaflets are all part of one leaf, or you can have palmately compound leaves. So again, if the image were correct, it would show all 5 of these leaflets emerging from the same point on the main leaf stalk. So looking at our plant here, if we're using a field guide, we could identify that this plant has pinnately compound leaves. So that's clue number 1 to what this plant might be. Maybe we can't figure it out early in the season, and so we let the plant grow a little bit and we can start looking at other characteristics. So looking at the petioles or the leaf stems, you might see descriptors in a field guide about them being absent or clasping, or you might have to see if they are longer or shorter than the leaf itself. And in this example, we have petioles that are clasping the stem of the plant. Looking at the stem itself, there's a lot of different descriptors you might see in a field guide. Some of them are listed here on your screen. And here we can see that this plant has a grooved stem. So we're starting to build some clues onto what this plant might be. Maybe we still haven't figured it out, and so we let it flower. And looking at the different flower characteristics like the shape, the petal color, and then even into the seeds, whether they're smooth or hooked or have attachments, we can maybe finally deduce that this is wild parsnip. And so let's go back to that question, isn't a weed just a weed? And if you're not too queasy, take a look at the lower right side of your screen, and that's what a wild parsnip burn can look like. And so that highlights the importance of being able to identify exactly what plants you have, particularly if you are in a high-use area where a lot of kids and adults are going to be interacting with your space. And it's also important to think about the fact that if you're trying to manage or control these plants, each species typically has a very specific technique that will be more or less effective for management. So let's talk about management. As I go through this, I'm going to kind of divide plants up into their different life histories. And so we'll start with annual plants, and these are the plants that start from a seed in the early part of the growing season. They grow, they flower, they set seed, and then the plant dies all in one growing season. And so to prevent these plants from spreading or taking over, you really want to just prevent the seed formation. And so if you encounter these plants in your school garden or forest, you want to concentrate on hand pulling or digging the plants, or at a minimum, cutting off the flower heads before the seeds can set and spread. Now, when you do this, you have to be aware that usually there's a seed bank that exists, meaning if you haven't controlled these plants in past years, there are likely seeds from past years that are still present in the soil and can still germinate. And so even once you start controlling these annual species, you might still see seedlings from these species pop up for a few years. If you're hand pulling or digging the plants, you also have to consider how you're going to handle soil disturbance, because once you disturb that soil, you're making a great environment for more weedy or invasive species to come on in. Moving on to a slightly more complex life history, our biennial plants typically grow as a basal rosette of leaves, so just a kind of circle of leaves close to the ground in their first year. And then in their second year, they'll send up that flowering stalk, they'll flower, they'll set out their seeds, and then that plant will die. So similar to annuals, if you can prevent seed formation, you're going to do a lot in terms of preventing these plants from spreading. And you can also kill the individual plants. Again, hand pulling or digging the plants is a great option, or cutting off those flower heads. Or if you have a larger biennial plant, something like bull thistle, you can also sever the taproot of that rosette or the bolting plant to just kill the plant before it even has a chance to form flowers or seeds. Same sort of considerations for managing biennial plants, including that seed bank that's going to be around for a while. On to simple herbaceous perennials or monocarpic perennials. So a monocarpic perennial, like wild parsnip shown at the right, are plants that exist as that basal rosette of leaves for a few years, and then once they send up their flowering stalk, that individual plant will die. Simple perennials will exist and be able to flower year after year, and what makes them simple is that they're not spreading by their root system typically. Like the biennials and annuals, they're primarily spreading. So we're kind of in the middle of discussing how to manage different life stages of plants, and talking about simple herbaceous perennials or monocarpic perennials. So these are typically relatively short-lived plants that don't spread via roots. They mostly spread with their seeds. And so the management for these is very similar to what you would do for the biennial plants. And as with all of these, once you start managing these plants, you're still going to have to deal with the seed bank. Moving into some more complex situations, our creeping herbaceous perennials are these plants that can spread by seeds, but also they're clonal, so they're spreading by lateral roots, also known as rhizomes. And so as kind of a first action against these plants, you can prevent the seed formation. So for something like Canada thistle, you can cut off those flower heads if you don't have the ability to do other management. But ultimately, to control these plants, you want to kill the roots. You have a few more management options for this, and you might need to go to some more extreme measures to fully control these plants. And so with a lot of these plants, you can hand pull or dig them, but any roots left in the soil are going to resprout. And the example of the plant on the top right of the screen is Japanese knotweed. This is a particularly aggressive invasive plant. And this one not only resprouts from the roots, it will also resprout from any fragments of the above ground plant that are left after cutting. So you can cut a Japanese knotweed branch off or the stalk off, lay it on the ground, and you might just start a new infestation where you laid that cut material. So with a lot of these plants, if you want to stick with mechanical management methods, repeated mowing or cutting will help you control these populations, but you're not likely to totally eliminate them. And you might need to resort to targeted foliar herbicide treatment to eliminate these plants completely and to kill off that root system. And with these plants, you really need to be worried about resprouting. So once you've managed it for the first time, expect that these plants will continue to resprout. And so make a plan for coming back to these plants or these infestations again and again to make sure that you're controlling them. Woody perennial species like the bush honeysuckle shown on this slide, with these, it can be a lot to deal with, partially because of the size of the plants. And so if you have a population that's producing a lot of fruit, you're going to want to go after the heavy fruit producing plants first. An example with buckthorn, That is an invasive shrub species that has separate male and female plants. And so the female plants produce the fruits, but the males don't. And so if you have a lot of it and you can't deal with it all at once, you can target those female fruit producing plants first so that you can eliminate the seed source and then start to tackle the larger population. With these plants, it can be a lot just to remove the top or above ground portion of these plants. So get some brush cutting in, and you can do this all year round. Ultimately, like our other perennial plants though, if you want to eliminate these fully, you're going to have to kill the root system. And so as with our other species, you can hand pull or dig these plants. Given that they're much larger, you want to be aware of your soil disturbance. You can cut off the flower heads, or in this case, the tops of the plants, to prevent those seeds from spreading. If you choose to cut the above ground portion, they will resprout. That's just in their nature. And so you'll have to come back and either repeatedly cut that resprout growth, or you can consider treating the cut stump with an herbicide or the leaves during the growing season with an herbicide. So considerations with this, again, are these plants do vigorously resprout, and so it's not a one and done thing. When you cut the tops of the plants off, you'll have to keep monitoring that. And then these plants often have a very long-lived seed bank. And so once you start managing these woody invasive shrub populations, you can expect that you're going to see seedlings popping up for several years to come. So those were some pretty general management recommendations. And I had mentioned earlier that management is really specific to the species that you're looking at. And so I wanted to share some of the identification and management resources that we have found to be useful in the FIRST Detector network. So for those of you in Wisconsin, you may have seen this before, but this is a guide that's applicable outside of Wisconsin as well. But this is a field guide developed by Wisconsin DNR. And you can order these field guides directly from DNR. They're pocket-sized, so that's great. One of the reasons why I like this field guide a lot is because it has really nice photos of the identifying features of these plants. And if you look at the right side of the field guide page, you'll also see that it compares the invasive species to similar looking native species. It also tells you a little bit about the ecological threats of these species. And so, like I said, you can either order these field guides directly from DNR, or if you do a Google search for these field guides, you can access a PDF. Through UW Extension, we also have a weed ID search tool, and you can access that at weedid.wisc.edu, listed here on the slide. And with this, you're basically going to enter the information that you know about your plant that you're trying to identify. And so I'd like to highlight in yellow the warning here that you don't want to answer too many questions. If you're not certain about one of the drop-down menus, just don't put anything there, because if you put the wrong thing, it might limit the results that you get. And so on the right side of the screen, you can see examples of the sorts of questions that you'll be asked. And if you look at the very top question, it will ask, where was this weed found? And you'll see that there's 3 different options right away: agricultural field, natural areas, and urban. And you would only want to make one selection from those 3 menus. If you're not sure what the field is asking for, you can click on that question box next to the drop-down menu that I've circled in red. And once you've filled in the information you know about your plant, you click Search Database at the bottom of the page. And you'll be given a list of species from the database that match your inputs, so the characteristics that you've identified on your plants. And it will show you pictures of the plants at different life stages. And so this output was an example from a plant that had milky sap, and these are the species that came up. Another really nice search tool that includes both native and weedy species is minnesotawildflowers.info. And so once you get to their homepage, on the upper right-hand corner of their website, you can click on Advanced Plant Search. And this is similar to the Wisconsin Weed ID tool in terms of you only want to put in the information that you're confident about with your plant. You can click on the question marks if you're not sure what it's asking you, and then hit search at the bottom of the page. And much like the Weed ID tool, you'll get an output with pictures and potential species that match your search criteria. The nice thing about this website, though, is that there's a profile for each species, so you can click on that blue link of the scientific name of the species. And in the profile, you'll see really nice descriptions on how to identify these plants, and also really great pictures of the different features of the plants and the plants at different life stages. I also want to point out a few resources that we have on our First Detector Network website, which is listed at the top of this slide. When you go to our website, along the right side of the page, you can click Access Fact Sheets and ID Videos, and then you'll see a table that looks like this. We have a series of identification videos available on YouTube that you can access from this website, and they're just 2 to 3 minute videos that show the species growing out in the world, so you can see what these plants look like in their habitats that they typically invade, and the people that are presenting in the videos point out the characteristics that you should look for when you're identifying these plants and point out similar looking native species. And you can also access these at UW Extension fact sheets. And so these fact sheets also have identification information on the front page, but they really are great for detailed management or control information. And so for each of the approximately 50 species that we have the fact sheets for, you'll see options for non-chemical or chemical control of these plants. And for each method, it's going to give you a rating of the effectiveness in season and the season after treatment. And so the effectiveness in season is the percent of that invasive infestation that you can control with that method in the season that you apply that management. And then the effectiveness the season after is if you don't do anything else, what is the percent control that you'll see the year after. It will also give you warnings or timings specific to each of these management methods, which I think is particularly useful for things like mowing, which has to be done at a specific time, or any of our herbicide applications. You want to make sure that not only are you following the label of the herbicide you're using, because that's the law, but also that you're considering your timing so that you're using the least amount of herbicide possible to have the most effective control of your plants. So with the First Detector Network, we also really focus on mapping and reporting invasive plants. So our Citizen Science Network is built on a network of folks that use tools to let us know where they're finding invasive plants. So in this latter portion of our webinar today, I wanted to touch on some of the tools we have for that. By no means are we going to get into how all of these things work, but I'll point out additional resources you can get to learn more about these tools, and I'll also remind you that I am more than happy to help you get set up with some of the tools if this is something that you're interested in using with your students or any other groups that you work with. So if you're joining us from Wisconsin, you have 3 main ways to report invasive species to our First Detector Network. One is using an online form on the EdMaps website. I'm not going to get much into EdMaps today, but it's basically a national database of invasive species reports. If you don't want to log in online, there's also an app called the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app, or GLEDN, and this allows you to map invasive plants out in your school garden or your school forest or wherever you are and upload those reports, and those end up in that EdMaps database. You can also email reports directly to our program at the email address listed on the screen. A little bit more about the app. This is a really great tool. It's free. You can use it on both smartphones and tablets. And so if you are lucky enough to work in a school that has access to tablets, this is something that you can get your students involved with, work on some citizen science. It allows you to accurately map the invasive species, so it'll give you the latitude and longitude of your location. And then within the app, you take photos of the plant. And so once you've uploaded the reports, myself and other folks on the back end see your reports and put them through a verification process before the reports are added to that EdMaps database and made public. And so there's a little bit of data quality control, but it also allows for a discussion between the app users and verifiers, so the app users can learn a bit about identifying plants. This app also has a built-in field guide, and so if you're using this as somebody who's not super familiar with invasive plants yet, it's pretty handy because you can kind of double check to see whether what you think you're looking at is actually what you're looking at. So as I said, I want to point to a few resources specific to reporting and mapping. And so back at our First Detector Network website, on the right side of the page, if you click on I want to report invasive species, you'll see a link at the top of the next page for our Monitoring Invasive Plants in Wisconsin handbook. And this is basically just a written guide on how to use the EdMaps website tools and the Glidden app tools. Again, this isn't something that I expect people to just pick up on from reading, so I'm more than happy to help you get set up with these tools too if you're interested in using them. We have a couple other resources on our website that I think are also interesting and you could use with your students. So the first is called the WisTip Viewer. You're probably realizing we use a lot of acronyms in our program. Apologies for that. But this is an interactive map that, again, you can access from our First Detector Network website. We have a Tools tab on our main menu. Click on WisTip Viewer. And this brings you to this great interactive online map of all of our known terrestrial invasive plant presence records in the state of Wisconsin. And so this map is updated every 2 weeks, and we are pulling the reports from the EdMaps database, and we've also included the data that from DNR that they're allowed to share publicly. So the view here that you see has the map on the left, which you can zoom in on, interact with. On the upper right side, you'll see a graph of the reports over time, and right below that graph is the legend of all the species. Using the drop-down menus, you could select one species at a time, or you can even just click on the species in the legend. And so here, the user just clicked on the species autumn olive in the legend, and that's the species that's highlighted on our map. With that drop-down menu, the user here selected the bush honeysuckle species in Wisconsin. And so you can see this combination of species and where those have been mapped. When you zoom in, this is the map zoomed into the Madison area. You can click on the individual records and see when it was reported and who reported it. And so if you use this, the mapping tools with your students, their points are going to show up on this map within a couple of weeks of being verified, and they can go back and see the species that they've reported. You can also download all of the information from this online tool. So in the lower right-hand corner of the tool, there's a download button, so you can download the map image. If you wanted to do anything with the data, you can download spreadsheets of the data as well. And I should mention on the First Detector Network website page where you access this viewer, there's also a one-page quick guide on how to use this interactive map. Another interactive tool that we've just released is our invasive species calendar. So here in Wisconsin, if you didn't know, we have an invasive species law that regulates over 240 invasive species, and I think about 150 of those are plants. And so we frequently get asked the question, like, with so many invasive plants, how am I supposed to know what to look for? And so this calendar, just like the map, is accessed from our First Detector Network page and has a quick guide on the First Detector Network. But this is what the calendar looks like. So it's basically a chart where on the left side of the chart you have the name of the species, and then going from left to right you have the months of the year. And our legend is on the right side of the page, so the colors denote the life stage of the plant that is most dominant in a given month. Everything from dormant or green vegetation, or whether it has flowers or fruits. And then the circles represent the detectability. So an open circle means that that plant is not detectable during that month, and then a fully filled in circle means that that plant is easiest to detect in that month. And then there's kind of the in-between low and medium detectability. And so people can start scanning through this and look for those filled in circles to see what species they might find. So if you look at garlic mustard, which is the fourth plant down, you can see those circles are filled in from April to July. And so you know that that's the time of year when you want to be on the lookout for garlic mustard. You can also customize your view on this calendar. using these drop-down menus across the top. And so we have options for habitat. So if you know you're working in a forest versus a prairie, you can start narrowing down the list of species based on habitat. If you wanted to focus on herbaceous or woody species, you can select those options from the form drop-down menu, and so on. And so basically you can create a custom calendar of what to look for your particular setting or time of year. And just like with the interactive map, you can also download this information. And we find that people might be interested in downloading a PDF of their custom calendar to use out in the field. And so if you're going to do that, you can select PDF as your format. The default on the next menu is to include this view. You can leave it that way, and then you can just download the PDF. So those are just a couple of tools that we've released pretty recently, and we're excited to have people explore them and to ask us questions about that. And I am more than happy to help brainstorm ideas on how this could be used in classroom settings as well. So that's all I've got for now. Hopefully we'll have some questions coming in, but my contact information is on this slide, and I really encourage you to reach out with any questions or thoughts you have on what we've covered today.
And thank you so much. That was just excellent. So many great resources to think about. And I know I'm planning on going and watching this webinar again to look through the resources again, and want to remind everyone that that's going to be made available to you as well. As we have time for some questions here, I encourage you to submit questions to Anne using the chat window, and also share some things about ideas about how you might see some of these tools used in your classrooms or with your organization, your volunteer efforts, maybe in your own yard, own lands you own, or other things that you're doing right now with your students in regards to native habitat or just learning about plants that you see connections with. One question that I had for you, Anne, is the identification tools that you shared. Do those work pretty well on mobile devices like smartphones or tablets?
So that's a great question. If you're talking about the Weed ID tool and the Minnesota Wildflowers tools, I think those are best used on computers. I don't think that they've been optimized for mobile use. It might be a little bit clunky to use it on a mobile device. If you do use the Gladden app, though, like I said, that does have a built-in field guide with both a description of the species and photos of the species. And so obviously, since it's part of an app, it is set up for mobile use. And people often ask me the question about whether there are any good plant ID apps where you can just take a picture of the plant and it will tell you what you're seeing. And to be honest, we don't have a good answer to that yet. So there are several plant identification apps available, and a lot of them operate kind of the same way in that as they've been around longer and as more images are included in the app, they're getting better and better at identifying species. But if you've been around plants, you know that things like leaf shape and size can be extremely variable even within one species. And so it's taking a while for the app algorithms to kind of figure that out. But I'd be curious if any of you have used plant identification apps you can and have had any success with it. It would be great to hear from you in the chat box about what you've used.
Great. So a lot of people that are joining us now or who will be looking at this webinar recorded are teachers. And some schools certainly have schoolyards or grounds like a school forest where they would see invasive species growing, but many do not. Do you have any ideas for how you see teachers and students working in this sort of process of identifying and then mapping and managing invasive species?
I think for teachers that are working in areas where you maybe don't have direct access to outdoor spaces, I think it might be worth just kind of looking around your general town or the area around your school. A lot of our recognizable invasive plants are really prevalent on roadsides. And so if you're interested in teaching about invasive species and you want your students to maybe start paying attention to where these are, things like wild parsnip, common teasel, purple loosestrife, Phragmites, these are all plants that grow a lot on roadsides and are pretty distinguishable from other plant species. And so you might be able to work on some identification of those plants through photos or bringing in a few samples and then asking your students to pay attention to the roadsides on their way to and from school or wherever they're traveling with their families and see if they notice where these plants are.
That's a great idea and a great point about how these plants are sort of, unfortunately, very prevalent in our lives, even if we're not in schools that have large schoolyards. I saw some photos during your presentation of some plants that I think I've also actually seen at nurseries for sale. I think you had some barberry in there. And I'm just wondering if someone is interested in doing a planting that does combine native and non-native plants, or they're just getting plants for their own home or schoolyard, are there any particular non-native species that you'd really recommend against using, especially plants that are commonly sold in nurseries?
Yeah, so this is starting to get into a little bit of how states regulate invasive species, and so I can speak very clearly to what's going on in Wisconsin. So if you're joining from another state, I might not be able to address the specifics of your state. But in Wisconsin, with our NR40 invasive species law, nurseries had a phase-out period for plants that are listed as invasive. And so if you're selecting plants to plant for your home or your school, the first thing you should do if you're in Wisconsin is head to the DNR website to see the list of regulated invasive plants. Or in states like Minnesota, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture regulates your species. And if the species is on that regulated list, you probably shouldn't buy it. Now with something like Japanese barberry, there are cultivars that are exempt from this law. And so you might see those cultivars for sale in the nurseries. And part of it is because barberry are widely planted, and so they're really economically important for the nursery industry. From an invasive species perspective, though, consider these plants, if they are fruiting cultivars, they're going to be spread by birds. And so you want to stay away from those non-native plants that have heavy fruit production. Another resource that I'll point out, if you're searching for plants and you want some ideas on maybe what to get to replace an invasive plant, or you want to make sure that you're buying something that is not invasive, whether it's native or not, the Midwest Invasive Plant Network has an app called Landscape Alternatives. And so you can download that, and that lists a number of very popular ornamental species that happen to be invasive. And then it gives you alternative options, either native or non-invasive options. And within those species profiles, it will help you decide, say if you want barberry because it has those bright red fruits and you like seeing that in the winter, it might suggest something like the native winterberry, which also has bright red fruits. And so it can help you kind of choose what you want based on the characteristics you're looking for in a plant.
That's a great resource, and thanks for pointing that out. We've got just one more question, I think, maybe a good one to close with. I know that in addition to the identification and monitoring efforts, you're also involved in a lot of active management of invasive species too. And I'm wondering if you've ever worked with volunteers, kids or adults, who've kind of gotten discouraged by the large scope of the challenge of managing invasive species. And if you have any words of wisdom or ideas to share with people who think that it's maybe a losing battle.
Yeah, admittedly, even as a professional working in the world of invasive species, we can sometimes feel a little bit like we're the doom and gloom squad. And so it is hard to have the perspective that you can do something. I would say there's a lot of successes to be had at small scales. And so I would focus on really doing what you can on a local scale to either increase awareness of invasive plants, whether that's talking to a local garden club and seeing what kind of plants they're recommending or selling and making sure that they're not selling invasive plants at their local plant sale, or whether it's getting involved with your town or city parks or county parks and drumming up some volunteers to work on managing invasive plants in a park. Every little bit matters. And the reality is invasive plants aren't ever going to wholly go away. We've reached a point where species are moving all over the world. There's no way we're ever going to be able to eliminate several of these species. But keeping an eye on the new incoming species. Something like Japanese barberry is really widely planted in a lot of landscape settings, but it hasn't gotten into too many forests yet compared to something like honeysuckle or buckthorn. And so we might just have to accept the fact that the ship has already sailed on some of these invasive plants and we might never get a handle on it. So let's focus our efforts on these newer invasives that we can control and keep out of our landscapes and keep from having the detrimental impacts on our landscapes.
Well, thanks for that, Anne. You've given us such a wealth of resources and information. Obviously, we all need different tools because this is a big set of issues that we're facing, and we're trying to work together for the health of our local ecosystems and our local habitat. So I really appreciate you sharing these different tools that people can use in their different environmental stewardship actions. Thank you for sharing your contact information, and we're really looking forward to sharing this webinar widely with all of our educator and community partners.